their children with these capacities. And this will put pressure on you, making you deciding against your own current determination. Technology always creates risks, always creates reaction, but as it becomes familiar and as it shows its potential, people always take the risk. So if you don't want to be excluded from the job market, and the job market, by the way, is the main focus of my article, if you don't want to be excluded of the job market, if you don't want your children to be left behind, you will think very carefully before deciding your negative, before making your negative decision. Are you convinced? No, maybe not. But I'm sure you are starting to think about the possibility I am giving to you. You may say that, but humanity is wise. Humanity will never take such risks. And if this thought crossed your mind, allow me to tell you with my apologies, you are kidding yourselves. Humanity is everything but wise. Humanity is ready to take all the risks. And let me give you some elements to prove that. In China, 50% of Chinese people say that they find acceptable the possibility of genetic manipulation using artificial intelligence in order to increase the capacity of men and women, of course, humanity, if you wish. 50% of the people are already positive, are feeling positively about this technology. You may say, but the example you gave us is not about genetic manipulation. Yes, I gave you a straightforward case of hybridization because of the conference, because of the subject of the conference, but I could, because the idea is not about seeing or not seeing. It is about whether we accept to increase artificially the capacities of humans as a natural being or not. We can do that through hybridization, but we can do that also through the manipulation of genetics. 50% of Chinese are already ready, if I may say so. It is important to know that there are two types of technology that have changed our world, or at least they are changing our world and ourselves. These technologies are high-tech and biotech. And the combination between these two technologies has potentially unlimited possibilities. We cannot imagine even now. Yes?
Can you remind me, you have 3 minutes left.
Thank you very much. That will be enough. So, you are not convinced? Even if you are not convinced, let me tell you that if individuals do not do that themselves, states will do that for them. Why? Because of the geopolitical advantage a state can have in having at its disposal an army of supermen, of super people, of very, very intelligent people. Today in China there is a project to try to discover the characteristics of people with extreme intelligence. And as soon as these genetic characteristics are discovered, believe me, attempts will be made to manipulate biology in order to include these characteristics. You are not convinced? You are right. Because the technology today does not allow me to say that hybridization will necessarily lead to such results. But hybridization today allows me already to say that the consequences are huge, especially on the job market. Today, we are witnessing a situation in which people who can use artificial intelligence are concentrating economic value between their hands, and we are seeing that people who are not contributing in this trend are, most of them, being victims without even knowing it, because they are losing their economic comparative advantages. If you are interested about the subject, you are very welcome to read my article. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayman, for this really very interesting talk and stimulating. Really set us thinking. Thank you.
And advertising for the marketing of the book.
That's
If you want advertisement, I have published a book about the subject called the Tadmir al-Khallaq. So I'm good at marketing myself.
Now, last but not least, we have our last panelist is hager, who will read to us a paper, well, present a paper, entitled Hybrid Populism and the Evolution of the American Far Right, the Democratization of Discrimination. Hager, you have the floor.
So hello everyone. My paper today is entitled Hybrid Populism and the Evolution of the American Far Right, the Democratization of Discrimination. I will be presenting it myself, ameur, and I hope you will pay attention. So the outline goes as follows. First, of course, we start with an introduction. Second, I will have a conceptualization of hybrid populism. Third, I will move to a historical pattern and the evolution of the far right. Fourth, I will talk about the standardization of discrimination through crisis manipulation. And of course, we will end with our conclusions. So, introduction. So the purpose of my paper lies in bringing forth a fresh perspective on the study of far-right populism, on far-right populism by examining the role hybrid populism plays in politically democratizing the ideological agenda of the American far-right throughout history. So I love this quote a lot because it emphasizes on the importance of definitions. So many a debate would have been deflated into a paragraph if the disputant had dared to define the terms. So I'll be starting there. So first, my first term is populism. So the numerous body of literature theorizing, defining, interpreting the phenomenon of populism is very daunting to navigate, which makes the definition of the phenomenon and concept very problematic. So I tried to map out two different approaches, or two dominant approaches to populism in the established literature, and I found that there is an emphasis on the centrality over leadership. What I mean by this, that scholars will have focusing on the leadership, the organization, the speeches, the character of the leader or the populist leader, and the second dominant theme is the centrality over the people, which is rather a bottom-up kind of approach with a focus on manifestos, statistics, people, grassroots movement. And the second issue at hand is the radical far-right manifestation. So as with populism, I tried through meticulous review of literature to pinpoint three recurrent scholarly commonalities. First, we have a capitalization on nationalism. We have scholars comparing or synonymously using the far right in America with nationalism. We have them juxtaposing it to fascism, which is same as nationalism using it synonymous to the phenomenon itself. And there is a theme of using a transatlantic approach to the study of far-right manifestation, which means it's more of a comparative between country kind of approach. So I'm taking the first route. My route is through hybrid populism and trying to go into a more in-depth trans-historic approach rather than a transatlantic one. So while there is a tendency among academics to examine populism and radical right-wing in a transatlantic and comparative capacity, this research focus on American model makes it opt for a more in-depth trans-historic analysis. Indeed, an overview of the historic evolution of populism in America reveals a necessity for a third hybrid method that comprises both top-down organizational galvanization and bottom-up decentralized mobilization. I'll come up to a more in-depth explanation of that later on. So these are the research questions. First, how could we account for the use of populism and radical far-right mobilization? In what way does American right-wing populism utilize themes of inequality in attracting supporters? And finally, how does the historical evolution of the American far-right standardize discrimination through crisis management? So first, conceptualizing hybrid populism. So you may ask me, what is hybrid populism? So through a critical overview of the literature, I was able to bring forth a personalized approach to defining populism in the US, while Casimir's minimalistic ideational approach to populism centralized on the role of the people as a bottom-up catalyst of change. Scholars adopting political strategic approach stress the top-down aspect of populism centralized on the role of leadership. So building on these two approaches, I conjured up an alternative model of populism that exposes both top-down and bottom-up methods. So I called it hybrid populism as a cyclical process. So I theorized that it started with a crisis, then we have the grassroots kind of popular unrest as a reaction to said crisis, moving on to an ideological formation of a solution, and then we have the capitalization of any kind of leadership over this popular unrest into like a political presence, and it goes on and on and on. So when a political economic crisis occurs, the people manifest their discontent through a rise of contentious grassroots social movements. The demands of these movements express two main ideas. The first one is the mass identity of the group and an identification of what the group opposes. The dichotomous identification of the self and the other innately denotes an ideological belonging, framing the movement's demand into prospective solutions. So at this stage, the ideological affiliation of the people is still malleable and up to interpretation. This explains how popular demands could morph into practical, political, and economic solutions to the crisis that could be absorbed, manipulated, or capitalized on by a top-down leadership process. So in other words, a movement's party emerged to galvanize the bottom-up cross-group popular incentive into a legitimized political or legislative momentum. Moving on to our historical pattern and the evolution of the far right, starting with establishing mass identity. So I'm going to quote Richard Hofstadter here on his essay on the pseudo-conservative revolt. He says, describing the very uncertain American identity by saying, because we no longer have a relative ethnic homogeneity we had up to about 80 years ago, our sense of belonging has long had about it a high degree of uncertainty. We boast of the melting pot, but we are not quite sure what it is that we will remain when we have been melted down. So this identity and the identity of Americanism is very much rooted in the idea of uncertainty and ever-changing boundaries. So let's start with nativism between nationalism and fascism. So there is a notable consensus among American historians to closely relate the rise of nativism in America with the birth of populism and populist tactics in the country. However, the bulk of literature on the nativist trend in American history highlights a murky quality to the term. Scholars tend to employ the word interchangeably or synonymously with both the notion of nationalism and fascism. This in turn puts the epistemic integrity of the term in jeopardy. Accordingly, a distinction between these three different concepts is paramount. So we starting with nationalism. Fundamentally, nationalism is the idea of a devoted allegiance to the nation or nation-state. As a movement, it tends to advocate and struggle for the interests and benefits of a particular group of people who share some specific historical, cultural, or social characteristics. So if the nation is a conceptualization of pseudo-flexible boundaries that are rooted in the commonality of a certain group and expressed in an actively sustained discursive narrative, nationalism is the ideological advocate of this narrative. So we can say that nationalism is thus circumstantial. It is often evoked in times of perceivable crisis to the harmonious boundaries of the nation-state. Moving on to fascism, so perhaps the simplest way to define fascism is to describe it as an extremist version of nationalism. The ideology denotes a strong reliance on a compulsory, unified, and monolithic nation closely and tightly controlled by autocratic leadership. Vehemently opposing democracy, liberalism, individualism, and Marxism, fascism is a manifestation of autocratic ultranationalism that draws on three main features: a strong control of socioeconomic sphere, a tyrannical leadership, and erosion of any opposition. So we can observe here that fascism is very anti-democratic. So we cannot say that nativism in the American context could be in any way, shape, or form fascism or neo-fascism. So we can conjure up that American nativism is neo-nationalist, and it's insistent on an ever-changing definition of Americanism. It's highly xenophobic and radical, and not extremism, because radical means it moves into the framework of democracy. So nativism in the United States rose to power in the 19th century. It came about as a political embodiment of anti-immigration sentiment of hostility. The movement was an intense opposition to an internal minority on the ground of its foreign connections. So we cannot speak of nativism in America without talking about the Know Nothing Party. So it emerged in the early 1980s as one of the first political manifestations of nativism. The high influx of immigration, chiefly the Irish in the East and the German in the Midwest, symbolized for the Protestant-born Americans a threat to their cultural, political, and national unity. The movement hence came about as a political quintessence to the growing anti-Catholic and immigration sentiment among the American public. So the identification of the people was in opposition to the alienation of the immigrant other. The boundaries of this movement are thus ethically and religiously constructive in the exclusion of the alien other. So what are the impacts of the party? The party called for restriction on immigration through capitalization on the idea of Americanism bound to ethnic limitation and vindictiveness. It paved the ground for movements such as the Immigration Restriction League and the anti-Asian movement in the West to emerge and successfully persuade the government into issuing the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this is also a way to show how the far right tried to democratize the idea of discrimination through persuading governments. Second, we have neo and paleoconservatism and the rise of the alt-right. So we move on now. Yeah.
Can I kindly remind you, you have 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll try. Yeah, okay. So we're moving on to another epoch. We're starting with the neocons and the counterculture. So they started as a reaction to the 1960s liberalism. They were at first liberals themselves, but they turned against the ideology and they were more into the interventionism ideology. Many prominent conservatives were part of the George Bush administration. Vice President, for example, Dick Cheney, and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld listened closely to neocons, and especially in the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Moving on to the paleoconservatives and the rise of the alt-right. So I'm describing them: polyconservatives press for restriction on immigration, a rollback of multicultural programs, and large-scale demographic change, a decentralization of federal policy, the restoration of control upon free trade, a greater emphasis upon economic nationalism, and an interventionism in the conduct of American foreign policy. So here we see a difference between the neocon and the paleoconservatives, because there is the neocon are pro-invention, imperialism and intervention abroad. However, the paleoconservatives are more republicanism in their thought and are more old-fashioned. So we're moving on to the paleoconservatism of the Tea Party. It rose as the Tea Party rose as a grassroots fiscally conservative political movement as a reaction against Obama's post-crisis politics. All of that, low taxes, deregulation, free trade, is all of their demands. So the movement capitalized on the polarized American society to gain incentive and in a time of crisis. So from the Tea Party to Trumpism and the Alt America, so the road to the Tea Party to Trump is quite straightforward. Indeed, Republicans who have positive view of the Tea Party movement in 2014 and 15 were among Trump's most enthusiastic backers during his 2016 impact. So Donald Trump came about as a political representation of nationalist sentiments, and his populist discourse addressed all the demands and frustration of the Tea Party supporters and activists. Moving on to the standardization of discrimination through crisis management. So what are the different types of discrimination we can think of? We can think of discrimination based on gender, based on class, or based on race or ethnicity. So I try to match this to the different kind of manifestation of populism, of far-right populism in American history, starting off with from nativism to the Know-Nothing Party. The crisis is the influx of immigration in the 1940s. It turns into conservative Anglo-Saxon popular unrest. The ideological formation of a solution is nativism, and then the capitalization or political capitalization of leadership is the Know-Nothing Party. And then we have the neoconservatives to the Bush administration, same thing, the fallen liberalism in the 1960s. The counterculture is the grassroots kind of movementism that happened. The solution is neoconservatism, and the political leadership is the Bush administration. The paleoconservatives we have and the rise of Trumpism, the economic crisis of 2008, moving on from the social movementism of the Tea Party, the political conservatism of paleoconservatism, and then moving on to Trump again. Moving on, I will end this with a conclusion. The populist ferment could be interpreted as interwoven into the historical background and political dynamic in America. The far right espouses a populist trend in the mobilization of public opinion in contexts prone to crisis. American politics has been losing much of its substance to the prevalence of identity politics. Populism thus presents itself as an alternative political mechanism. Perhaps its floating quality of serving social contention and birthing political momentums is reminiscent of Eben Graf's vision of identity politics revolving around the rejection of the other. Thank you for your attention. That's all.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our four distinguished panelists for their very stimulating talks. Normally we should have a discussion, but as we're lacking in time, we're 15 minutes late, we'll keep the discussion for the next panel. So Professor Patich will chair this panel in a minute. Thank you very much.